morning, everyone. Good morning. Please, before we begin, if you have a cell phone, silence it. Good morning to Acting Chief of Staff, President Donald J. Trump, Mick Mulvaney, Congressman Brendan Boyle, Ambassadors Lamborghinis and Soecha, Assistant to the President and Trade Council Director, Dr. Navarro, the Diplomatic Corps of various embassies, Dr. Auslin and Ms. Kompanek, members of the press, and our audience here and online. Thank you for joining us. My name is Richard Kraemer. I'm the Republican co-chair of the U.S.-Europe Alliance. The USEA is a bipartisan American organization, and our aim is to mobilize Americans to advocate for the enduring U.S.-Europe partnership. Recently, European leaders have spoken of Europe going it alone, and that Europe can no longer rely on the U.S. Similar sentiments have been expressed on this side of the Atlantic. With that, I'll respectfully suggest that no one in this room is especially satisfied with the current state of U.S.-Europe relations. This uneasiness is not due to any single administration. Rather, it has been growing for some time. We, Americans and Europeans, have been taking for granted what should be our cherished relationship. Our partnerships, based on shared democratic values, achieved unprecedented stability and prosperity in the face of existential military threats and severe economic downturns. They're being neglected to our peril. Previous disengagements and isolationism ended tragically for Americans and Europeans alike in wars large and small. History has clearly shown that we are bound by our collective security concerns. Our economies stayed the same. The transatlantic marketplace takes up 30% of global trade and 50% of its GDP. This economy, is the world's most integrated, and it provides over 15 million jobs. However, we're not simply driven by these mutual benefits, but significantly by the common values which underlie them, including rule of law, representative government, open markets, and respect for individual freedoms. Today, our speakers will consider the unequivocal importance of the transatlantic alliance and external threats to its future, in particular, China's ruling party and its gross disregard for fair play, rules, and basic human rights. Before turning it over to our distinguished speakers this morning, I'll emphasize the following. Without the sincere willingness of American political leadership to reach a hand across the aisle in the same spirit of cooperation that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union, we will fail. We will fail our friends in Europe, we will fail our home communities, and in due course, our children. Throughout the 20th century, we Americans were torn at times in the struggle for civil rights, the role of government in our lives, and over many other fundamental questions. Yet we set these differences aside when faced with a foreign threat from abroad. So many generations have sacrificed their young as soldiers fighting for America's safety, as well as for something as great, the freer, more peaceful world that we all enjoy. With great challenges ahead, it would be shameful to disregard the grave losses they have borne, as well as those borne by their loved ones, for the fleeting and passing political scorecard. Let us, Americans united, show a renewed desire and readiness to engage with our long-standing transatlantic allies, in the belief that, with their equal reciprocation, we will face these challenges with mutual respect, understanding, and resilience as partners and friends. That is, as a community. I thank you, and with that, I turn the podium to my dear friend, Mick Mulvaney. Mick?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's good to see some friends. It's good to see Mr. Boyle. Looking forward to hearing what he has. I might actually stick around here. For those of you who don't know me or know us, Brendan and I have worked together on a couple different things. even though we're in different parties. I know that sounds bad sometimes. I'm excited to be here, and thank you, Richard, again, for the invite to sort of just give you very briefly some administration perspective on the transatlantic relationships right now. And I welcome the opportunity because as I sit and read the conventional wisdom and I see the mainstream media, I hear the narrative, and the narrative seems to be that there's tension, that there's a cooling of the relationships, that we are unreliable in our partnerships and so forth. And all I can tell you is that while there may be bits and pieces that may fit that narrative, it is not accurate of a larger relationship. We'll talk a little bit about what the administration has been doing and why, stuff you may be familiar with, things you may not be familiar with. And one thing I know you're not familiar with is it was a private discussion, and I don't usually talk about my private conversations with the president, but it is one of my favorite stories about working with the president, was that, I don't know, a year and a half ago, well before I was in the office of the acting chief of staff, we were at dinner one night, and he looks at me and says, a very small dinner. It was me, John Kelly was there, one other cabinet member, so four of us having dinner. And the president looks at me and goes, hey, Mick, what is that thing next week in Europe? What is that thing? I said, Davos? He says, yeah, I want to go to that. What do you think about that? I said, Mr. President, that's a terrible idea. And he said, why? And he said, well, because I don't think anybody over there is going to be particularly excited to see you, and I don't think anybody here is going to be glad that you went. And he looks at me and goes, no, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong. John, I'm going. And he went. And if you remember what happened at Davos, it was one of probably the biggest international successes the president's had since he's been here. And he went for one reason and one reason only, I think. He went to go deliver that line about America first does not mean America alone. He wanted the largest microphone and podium that he could have to deliver that line because it was important to him and to the administration and to the government. And it worked. I think it worked relatively fabulously to go in that environment and deliver that line at the exact appropriate time. And I think that has sort of set the stage for everything that's happened since then. I was commenting today about some of the things that have happened since we've been here. Since I've been in the office of the acting chief of staff, which is I think 6 months next week, we have met with the UK several times, not the least of which was our most recent trip overseas, during which time the president not only met with Theresa May, but with all, either all directly or the representatives, all of the likely candidates to be the next prime minister. We met with, I think Boris was not available in London that time, we met with his representatives, we met with Jeremy Hunt. I talked with Mike Gove, the president, I think, met with Nigel Farage. So not only do we engage with the existing government, but the representatives of the most likely next government. This is part of a regular relationship that we have in the UK. The president talks frequently with our British counterparts. The same is true with the French. We met with Mr. Macron when we were over in France. I think meeting again next week. We talk regularly. The same is true with Germany. Austria has been here. Hungary has been here. We talked to the Italians on the phone. The Czechs have been here. The Poles have been here. And we talked to we meet the Turks again at the G20. Again, not all these things percolate up in the mainstream media most of the time, but the relationship between the United States and our European friends and colleagues and allies is extraordinarily strong and vibrant. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say that a week does not go by when we do not have some direct contact between the President of the United States and the leader of one of our European friends. And I think that speaks great volumes as to the interest that we have in maintaining those relationships. Do we have challenges? Sure. The world is a complex and difficult place, and to think that everything is going to be 100% hunky-dory all the time simply does not reflect reality. I'll speak specifically, for example, to the NATO agreement. We absolutely, without reservation and hesitation, believe in Article 5 and will commit to the Article 5 of the treaty. The President's question is fairly simple. Look, we've got the treaty says what we're going to do, and we're going to do all of these things. Now we also have this other side agreement, we've got a couple of them. In fact, one of them says everybody's going to contribute 2% of their nation's GDP to national defense. Okay? That is a commitment. It's not in the treaty, we get that. But it's an agreement amongst allies, amongst friends, amongst colleagues to do something important. And the President's question is fairly simple, which is, when are you going to do it? We're doing it. We've been doing it forever. When are you going to do it, Germany? You promised us that you would. It's important to us that you do. It's important to everybody. It's important to the entire organization that you do that. When are you going to do it? And please, please, please don't tell us that you can't afford to do it because you're making commitments on your climate change policy. That's not an acceptable answer. That was not the agreement. The agreement was not, but we'll give 2% if we can, or if we don't have other priorities in our domestic spending. That wasn't the deal. The deal was we all kick in 2%, and that's what the president is pressing on, and I think he's right to do so. In fact, several of our other European allies say that we are right to do so. The Poles would love to see some of the richer countries in Europe increase their defense spending. The Baltics feel the same way. So I don't think we're alone in wanting to see countries that are part of the NATO agreement live up to the terms of the agreement. We've got similar concerns with energy security. Okay? I think it's not unreasonable to ask the question of Germany, why are you cutting a deal with the Russians for your gas? That is not an unreasonable question for an ally to ask. Energy security is real. The Russians have used it against the Georgians. The Russians have used it against the Ukrainians. So it's not unreasonable to ask the Germans, why are you putting yourself in this box? Is it because your former prime minister is on the board of directors of the Nord Stream company? That's not an unreasonable question to ask. It does not mean that we are not friends. It does not mean we're not allies. It simply means that we like to know what is going on and why our friends and allies are doing some of the things that we are. Lastly, on 5G, again, one of the more pressing issues I think that doesn't get nearly enough attention. There are some European countries I think that get it, that are cautiously sort of conscious of the challenges that 5G, especially with Huawei, presents. We think there's other countries that need to do more, to look more critically at the risks that going down that particular road create. I don't think that those things, energy security, spending on security, 5G issues, I don't think raising those questions means that we are not friends, and that we're not allies, and we cannot work together. Having a candid conversation amongst folks who work so closely together, and as closely as we do with our European friends, I think helps strengthen the relationship in the long term. And maybe the bigger story is why haven't those conversations taken place in a more candid way up to now. So I hope that's part of your discussion. I'm not going to go to trade because I know Peter's here. He's going to be here this afternoon. I know he's always fun to watch. But I do appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you for doing this and creating a forum where we can have these types of conversations, because we think they're extraordinarily important. So with that, I'll introduce my good friend, Boyle, from Pennsylvania.
Well, thank you very much. And as Mick mentioned up front, you might not have been aware when you made these introductions inviting a very prominent Republican, White House Chief of Staff, and a not as prominent Democrat. You're also inviting two very good friends. Back when Boehner wouldn't hang out with Mick, I would, and I was on the other side of the aisle. So it is actually unintentionally a great symbol of the important bipartisanship that happens. It still happens here, believe it or not. If not in front of the camera, certainly behind the scenes. And transitioning to the topic for today, so important in terms of our foreign policy, especially as it relates to the U.S.-Euro alliance. But first, let me just applaud the vision of those who founded this organization. I think that it is very important at this time in our history. For 7.5 decades now, the single most important alliance in the world has been the alliance between the United States and Europe. Full stop. With all due respect to my friends in other continents, it is this alliance that has built the modern world that I've enjoyed for my entire lifetime and my parents' lifetime. For 7.5 decades, from Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy, through Reagan, the Bushes, Clinton, and Obama, we have held together on a bipartisan basis that alliance. It has preserved the peace in Europe. It has also built the GDP of most of the world powers, with a few exceptions, such as Japan. It has essentially written the rules of the world order. I come here to tell you, unfortunately, that I think that right now, that alliance is under a greater threat than certainly any time in my lifetime. For some of you who are wondering, I'm 42. You know, one of the great things about the fall of the Soviet Union is, at least for a period of time, it seemed as if that external threat went away. That was the greatest threat that the transatlantic alliance faced, particularly NATO, from the late 1940s until the 89, 90, 91 period. Certainly that external threat still remains. Just ask the people of Georgia since 2008, or the people of Ukraine over the last 5 years or so, and the people of the Baltics who look across their borders somewhat nervously. But I'm telling you, and one of the reasons why I was anxious to accept this invitation, is that the greatest threat today, unlike most of the last 7.5 decades, is not external, it is internal. It is internal within countries that make up this alliance because of the rise of populism. We have just seen, in election after election over the last several years, the rise of populist movements all over the ideological spectrum, and some that you couldn't even place on an ideological spectrum. The collapse of traditional center-left and center-right parties is deeply worrying. The sort of anti-treaty, anti-multi-party agreement rhetoric that we see sometimes in trade, but also in other non-trade areas, is a threat to the transatlantic alliance. One specific example that deeply troubles me and worries me, and I've been quite active on this issue, is Brexit. We are at almost exactly the 3-year anniversary, just passed it, of the Brexit vote in 2016. At the time, people worried that this might be the beginning of the end of the European Union, which to some, myself included, could be considered one of the longest and most successful running peace plans in the history of Europe and the history of the world. It turns out that was not the case, that in fact Brexit helped spur other European countries to rally around one another. But what Brexit showed both in 2016 and has shown since then is that this sort of movement, anti-elitist, anti-globalist, however you define them, has resonance, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in parts of Germany, parts of France, all over. That presents a wonderful opportunity for Putin and others who would wish us ill to exploit. That is the greatest threat we face today in this alliance. I recently, in January, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee for 4 years and then rolled off that to be appointed to Ways and Means. But I was very happy to be appointed to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And I've had the opportunity now to participate in 2 of the conferences. In interacting with my interparliamentary colleagues, whether they're from the traditional right parties or traditional left parties, they are seeing exactly the same things in their society. I believe a lot of it happens to relate to a certain stagnation within the middle class, particularly those who don't have the benefit of a higher education. You see a lot of commonality, whether you're talking about northeastern Pennsylvania or the north of England. Nonetheless, whatever the cause, it's there. And if we don't have groups such as this, and such as others, to remind people why the transatlantic alliance is so important, indeed so crucial, we risk losing it. I was very happy that in 2016, like in every election, presidential election of my lifetime, support for NATO really didn't come up. Support for our European allies didn't come up. Trade certainly was a dominant issue, and there are those within both parties who are more trade skeptical, at the very least believing, as I do, that after 25 years it is time for a reevaluation of NATO, or of NAFTA. Not a reevaluation of NATO, but a reevaluation of NAFTA and a certain updating of it. Nonetheless, conversation about the certain assumptions that we take for granted about the United States-European alliance wasn't really discussed. I wonder if that's going to be the case moving forward. I wonder if this is going to grow legs, and that the populists within our own country and within other countries will challenge whether or not this alliance is worth it. We are seeing it elsewhere already in Europe. So ladies and gentlemen, I am not by nature an alarmist. In fact, I am by nature very much an optimist. As an immigrant son, I think that that is probably a trait that all immigrants' families share. A belief in self, a belief in this country, a belief that tomorrow will be better than today. But I have to tell you, before we're going to get there in this alliance, much work is needed. That's here in the US and indeed within all of our European partners. But I look forward to rolling up my sleeves with you, being committed to doing that work, celebrating the remarkable achievements of this alliance over the last 7.5 decades, and working to make sure that continues into the future. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, Mr. Mulvaney and Congressman Boyle. My name is Reuf Bajrovic. I'm the Democratic co-chair of the U.S.-Europe Alliance. As we heard from our two distinguished speakers, we believe that U.S.-Europe Alliance is and must be a bipartisan matter, which is why I'm very pleased that we're having this event at such an important and crucial time in this alliance. I think that of the 750 million Europeans, almost 40% live outside the EU. And this is why our alliance, America's alliance, with Europe, has to be broad and include every country on the continent. Strains on the transatlantic relationship certainly provide an opportunity for outside malign forces to extend their influence all across the continent. In this case, we're mostly going to be talking about, in the next panel, the Chinese Communist Party, which aims to enjoy the fruits of free trade and market access that we created, US and Europe, while engaging in currency manipulation, theft of intellectual property, and spreading of its practices of social control and corruption globally. EU Commission rightfully calls China a systemic rival. That's EU Commission official position. Facial recognition technology in Serbia, Huawei 5G mobile networks across Western Europe, Chinese police patrolling in Croatia's historic city of Dubrovnik are just some examples of Beijing's coercive influence. US-Europe Alliance will passionately advocate for the defense of freedom, democracy, and the rules-based economic global order, which has lifted billions out of poverty across the world. Rule of law is the cornerstone of a country's prosperity. Similarly, a rules-based order is the only way the global trade system can be sustained in the long run. We will take this message to the American people in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Arizona, and others. Our plan is to engage ordinary Americans who don't yet think of themselves as Atlanticists and make them the champions of the transatlantic community. We will create unique opportunities for Americans to engage in this vital matter and involve local and regional media to reach new audiences. We believe that American and European companies and the working classes deserve to be protected from unfair trade and predatory practices. Despite our occasional disagreements, and there are a few as we heard, our European friends stick to the rules of the global order and play fair. A successful and lasting response to present and future challenges demands our vigilant cooperation with Europe. I think it'll be costly on both sides, but less so than illusory hopes that they can be met without a unified transatlantic community. We at USCA believe that this is a message that will resonate with the American people with sincerity, facts, and the simple truth that we must work together. I thank you now, and I'm going to invite our amazing executive director, Mr. Scott Cullinane, who will be moderating the upcoming panel, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming, especially the members of the diplomatic community who I haven't mentioned, but thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Scott Cullinane, and I'm proud to be the Executive Director of the U.S.-Europe Alliance. I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Navarro, who will provide opening remarks for our panel discussion on how the U.S. and Europe came together to confront the challenges of the 21st century. Dr. Navarro is an Assistant to the President and Director of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. In this role, he advises the White House on policies to grow the economy while strengthening America's industrial and defense base. I'd like to invite our panelists to join me on the stage and take their seats. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Navarro to the podium.
Thank you, sir. It's great to be here with you this morning. I want to talk about a few things before we get into the issue of China, the EU, and the U.S. First of all, perception isn't always reality, and vice versa. If you look, for example, at our relationships with Canada and Mexico over the last several years, at times it's looked contentious. Yet, we are on the verge of passing, if Congress chooses to do so, the most sophisticated, smartest, and largest multilateral trade deal in world history, the U.S.-Mexico Canada agreement. And if you understand what that deal does, it basically has three components. The first is there's these things called rules of origin. It basically dictates that if you're going to manufacture something, it needs to be done on North American soil. And so we have stricter rules of origin for automobiles and other products, combined with very strong environmental and labor protections that will ensure that the manufacturing jobs stay here in the hemisphere, not go elsewhere. That's a good thing for the alliance between Canada and the U.S. and Mexico. The second thing the USMCA does is modernize an old NAFTA. It brings in a digital economy, it brings in intellectual property, it brings in services, three things that the United States has competitive advantage in, so that'll be strong. And to the point of the discussion today, there's a third aspect of it where we add very strong disciplines for unfair trade practices by countries like China that include disciplines on things like currency manipulation, state-owned enterprises, and the abuses of non-market economies. So you might look at the dialogue we've had in Canada and the U.S., Mexico and the U.S., and at times it's been bumpy, yet we're achieving great things. And I think the point is that it's only through honesty about one's disagreements that you can come to some kind of truth. And we need to have that similar process with respect to the European-U.S. alliance. Of course, this administration is for an absolutely rock-solid alliance between the EU and the U.S., but please understand that our differences with the EU are no more disparate than the differences within the EU. And the EU itself is split apart on many different issues, fiscal, monetary policy, currency, how to deal with Huawei, how to deal with China. I'll get into that in a minute. So the two things I want to talk about in terms of being clear-eyed about our alliance is this organization goes forward to do great work. I want to really encourage you to recognize that there's a couple of things that really represent friction in this relationship that will be ongoing and need to be dealt with. The first one, Chief Mulvaney mentioned, I brought a chart which basically shows the percent of GDP that each of the European countries are spending on defense apropos of their commitments to the NATO alliance. And the countries in the green are the only ones that are hitting 2%, right? And you can see that that's a small minority. If you go down and look at the countries in the red, the two that jump out at you are Germany and Italy, large economies, large prosperous economies, and they're nowhere near the 2%. And the problem we've had historically is that whether it's Asia, as Michael Auslin is well aware of, or Europe, people love our national security umbrella, but they don't necessarily want to pay for it. Now, my good friend in the front row here is the ambassador of Bulgaria. To me, is like a shining light of how we can have great relationships with Europe because, for example, his country has committed to buying F-16s, and with that single purchase, Bulgaria is going to jump from here right up into the green. Okay? Now, why do we like that? Well, first of all, it honors the commitment to NATO. It makes the alliance stronger. That's national security. But it also allows us as a nation to go, and I was down there personally to do this, do a ribbon cutting down in Greenville, South Carolina, to set up an F-16 production line. Slovakia stepped up to the plate for this. And it created 400 jobs in Greenville, 1,100 in South Carolina, and about 16,000 across the great United States. Economic security is national security, is one of the themes of this administration. So I would say to this organization and to folks who are concerned about a strong European-U.S. alliance, we need to deal with this national security issue because there's bad folks out there that may threaten the continent, and it's not clear we're ready for that in this kind of situation. Now, the second thing I want to raise, again, to be clear-eyed, is this issue of trade. Now, I was struck by this wonderful phrase that you said, where Europe plays by the rules, and the rules are fair. Okay? The problem is that Europe may play by the trade rules, but the rules are not fair. I take exception to that. We have a situation under the World Trade Organization. There's a clause called Most Favored Nation, and it allows foreign nations to charge the United States of America significantly higher tariffs than we charge those nations for the same or similar products. Let me say that once more. It's perfectly legal, if not fair, for foreign countries to charge our exporters higher tariffs than the U.S. charges their exporters on the same or similar products. Now, my office did a study about how ubiquitous this was. We looked at over 500,000 product lines across 132 countries. The worst countries are India and China. China charges higher tariffs 85% of the time. India is 90% of the time. But Europe's 50% of the time, and we only charge higher tariffs about 20% of the time. And the problem we have with Europe, and I've heard the president say this many times, and he's absolutely right, the problem we have with Europe is that because of its unfair trade practices, we run a $150 billion plus trade deficit in Europe. And for every $1 billion of the trade deficit, that's 6,000 jobs that are produced offshore from America. So that trade deficit on our end and trade surplus on Europe's end is supporting a lot of economic activity that might otherwise be shared. So those are the two things I think that are going to be ongoing friction in the relationship. And I think we can get a great deal on trade with Europe, just like we did with Mexico and Canada. And I think on the NATO issue, it's just a matter of countries stepping up to the plate and doing what they need to do in a dangerous world. And we need to get that done. Now let me finish up with just an overview of the China problem. Okay? It's a big, big issue. And I know that Congressman Boyle seemed to think that economic nationalism was the big problem and populism in Europe, but my own view is that China is way up at the top of the list. And so when we were trying to do a trade deal with China, and we continue to do so, the President's on his way to Osaka with Ambassador Robert Lighthizer to see where we go from there, we're dealing with 7 problems, that's 7 structural problems, and these are not unique to the U.S. And please, everybody in this room, if you can leave here, if you remember anything I say today, remember these 7 issues, okay? These should roll off your tongue. If you're concerned about Europe's economy, Europe's national security, you should understand what's in the China playbook, okay? Cyber intrusions into our business networks. We just had another example today in the news when in 2015 in the Rose Garden, the president of China said they weren't going to do that anymore. Okay? This is a way of stealing the economic, capital, and trade secrets of the world. Okay? Intellectual property theft to the tune of several $100 billion a year. Okay? Subsidies. Okay? Subsidies. Huge, massive subsidies and dumping on steel, aluminum, old traditional industries, but now it's robotics, building up tremendous overcapacity in automobiles, which are going to flood not just into Europe, but into the markets that European automakers sell to. Currency manipulation, a long history which you mentioned. These are all of the issues, and we had a deal. We had 7 chapters in a 150-page plus agreement which they reneged on. So let's see where we go. But here's what the problem is facing Europe. China has a big checkbook. And if you try to get a loan from China, it takes about 5 minutes. If you try to get a loan from anybody else, I mean, we couldn't even get the XM bank rolling here. It's crazy. It's crazy. So what China is doing, there's the thing called the 16+1. I hope we mention that today. That is about pernicious as you can get, right? 16 Central and Eastern European countries entering into the debt trap financing web of China. Hungary's got $3+ billion coming. Bosnia, Serbia. I mean, China just throws money at you. They encumber your resources. And now Greece doesn't even own one of the classic ports in the world. Okay? So we have China coming in. The United States has been trying to ensure with Huawei that we have a secure, innovative 5G network that creates jobs, not just here, but also in places like Europe. I mean, Ericsson and Nokia, for example, are the 2 tips of that spear that Huawei is blunting. But we can't even get the Netherlands, right, to not buy that cheap stuff. See, it's the cheap stuff. It's the addiction of China's subsidized cheap stuff that they've been able to bring the world into, and then they have their way with you. So this is going to be an ongoing issue. I think in the panel, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more of it. But one of the things I think that we can unite on with Europe is against the unfair trade practices, mercantilist practices, and national security threats that China poses. So why don't we have that discussion, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you very much. Allow me to to briefly recognize and introduce our two other panelists. We have to my immediate left, Anna Kompanek, who is the Director of Global Programs at the Center for International Private Investment, or SITE. Enterprise, sorry. SITE, where she serves as expert on anti-corruption and economic reform. And then next to her is Dr. Michael Auslin, the Payson J. Treat Fellow in Contemporary Asia at the Hoover Institution. He is the author of the best-selling book, The End of the Asian Century, War, Stagnation, and the Risks to the World's Most Dynamic Region. We both developed a lot of interesting comments this morning, and a lot to chew on. Maybe I can give each of you a few moments to offer your insights and your perspectives on the topic of what we've heard so far. Maybe Anna, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you so much, Scott, and it's a pleasure to be here. As a European and as an American, let me just start by saying how excited and how supportive I am of this initiative, of the importance to remind ourselves how crucial the transatlantic relationship has been, how much we have accomplished together historically, how much more we can do together if we stay committed to this transatlantic relationship. Given the nature of my work, though, I would also like to spend a few more minutes on placing the current state of the transatlantic relationship and many trends that have been mentioned already in a broader global perspective. So just a quick word of introduction. Center for International Private Enterprise, or SITE, is a part of the National Endowment for Democracy and an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So our very founding and our mission is the concept that democratic institutions and market institutions, so political freedoms and economic freedoms, go together and can be a source of strength, growth, progress, as, again, I think the transatlantic alliance over the last several decades illustrates. However, we are living in the world today where those very basic universal values are increasingly coming under strain, under question, where the value of democracy, the ability of markets to deliver prosperity is questioned and has given rise to populist movements, not just on both sides of the Atlantic, but also we see similar trends in countries around the world. Political polarization happens not just in the US and in Europe. One challenge that maybe we don't see as much on the scale as in other countries, but I must mention corruption. You know, many countries, transition countries especially, that saw the promise of democracy and markets, let's say it wasn't implemented in an optimal way, and the reaction to it, you know, in countries from Afghanistan to South Africa is, well, if this is what, you know, democracy or markets mean, I'm not sure I really like that as a citizen. So the problems with sort of definitions and perceptions of what true open political and economic system should look like give rise to that level of dissatisfaction. On the economic front, definitely the 2008 global financial crisis has contributed to the questioning of whether free and open markets can deliver prosperity for citizens, giving rise to the feelings of economic disenfranchisement, which again feed into political discourse and political polarization. Another key trend already mentioned here is the rise of new technologies, which again at the outset carry a lot of promise, but can also and are being misused by regimes that, for instance, take technologies such as AI to surveil and repress and not empower. And finally, as already mentioned again by previous speakers, we see the geopolitical trends where resurgent authoritarian countries such as China, such as Russia, are out there. We'll see pockets presenting an alternative model to many other transitioning and developing countries that often find it very hard to resist. And that model is based on a very different playbook and rulebook than what U.S. and the European alliance has been based on. Now, these trends may seem like, or sort of our realization of, well, that is what's happening in the world today, may seem somewhat sudden, but they are rooted in deeper and long-lasting trends. To me, sort of a symbolic moment where the divergence of the global trends happened took place on June 4th, 1989, 30 years ago, pretty much to the date. On that date, Poland, where I'm from originally, held its first partially free democratic election after World War II, which was overwhelmingly won by Solidarity, and became the beginning of an opening in that part of the world of reform. In Central and Eastern Europe, that certainly with challenges has continued to that day and has led to political and economic opening in line with giving more freedom, protecting human rights. On the very same day, a very different scenario unfolded in Beijing. That is the anniversary also of the Tiananmen Square massacre, of the government that quashed the democratic aspirations of its people and proceeded with political opening and only partial economic opening, as we heard, that even though it was supposed to follow the rules of WTO membership, hasn't quite lived up to those norms in a number of ways that have been enumerated here with IP issues, technology theft, and so on. That is where we stand today. That is the world of challenges we face. I hope we'll have a little bit more time to talk about solutions, but I will maybe pause my remarks here and hopefully we'll get back later in the discussion.
Thank you very much. Dr. Auslin?
Thank you. Thanks to Rich and Reuf for having me here, Scott. As a historian, I just have to note at the beginning that 20, 30 years ago, certainly 40 years ago, we wouldn't have needed an organization like this. The transatlantic relationship was understood and in some ways taken for granted, but it was understood how important it was. So it's a measure also of the success of that relationship, that we've had a long period where it could be just sort of put to the side while the United States dealt with other issues. The problem is jumping back into that sphere when you haven't thought about it for a while. And the human capital hasn't necessarily been built in order to have the fluidity to understand what's happening at different points around the continent and how that affects the United States. So I find it just interesting when Rich first approached me from a historical perspective to think in some ways how we're going back to the future on Europe and hopefully not too far back. But I find myself in a slightly odd position here today as where I'm familiar as the Asianist in the room and amongst a group of experts on Europe and who are knowledgeable on Europe and people interested in Europe. This is not the usual audience I talk to. So I'm going to try to give you the Asian perspective, if I can, from obviously the U.S. set of interests. The other thing that is odd about talking, for me, talking in this venue is that for the most part, since 1945, the United States has gone it alone in Asia in terms of the relationship with Europe. We haven't had much partnership with Europe in Asia. In part, that's because we set up our own alliances in Asia, 5 alliances, not a collective security community like NATO, but what we call the hub and the spoke, the U.S. being the hub, and then 5 spokes radiating out to 5 treaty partners, and then other nations such as Taiwan and Singapore with which we have special relations. We tried something more collaborative and cooperative in the SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. That didn't work, but we never thought about how would we link together, for example, Japan and Korea and Australia and the Philippines into something that resembled NATO. So whereas we were talking here at different points about are we in a new era where the United States wants to go it alone, maybe some European countries want to go it alone. In Asia, we've always gone it alone, but we can't do that anymore. And we can't do it for 2 reasons. The first is that the People's Republic of China is simply too powerful in many ways for the United States to simply try to deal with it alone. We need partners. And those alliances that I just mentioned in Asia were not set up initially with China in mind. Right? They were set up against Russia. In some ways, they were actually set up to maintain a democratic Japan and keep Japan from becoming a revanchist nation again. But today, we have to think about how we reorganize those alliances and how we bring in others and our European partners to deal with China. And the second, of course, is what we've been talking about so far today, which is China's inroads into Europe. And therefore, if we are thinking about the U.S.-European relationship, we have to think about it from that Asian perspective. Very interesting, by the way, if you think about the clashing modes of international statecraft that we're going to witness in Europe, is that part of what's happening across the continent, to some degree or another, is a reaction against the EU. If we're talking about populism, we're talking about nationalist parties. It is the fact that the EU increasingly operates in a unified way that tries to efface national borders. But China's strategy has always been to divide and conquer. So it's going into an environment in which the trend over the past 20, 30 years has been for greater integration. But what China always tries to do is peel off individual nations. And actually, some of that has been mentioned here. Let me just spend a minute or so then talking about how to think about the U.S.-Europe relationship in the context of dealing with China from two perspectives. First, inside Europe, and then second, inside Asia. I want to stress that because we haven't talked about that much today. There's not as much as I want to add. People have covered it. Peter covered it very well. But just to reiterate a few of the challenges that we face, which is the same challenges the United States is dealing with in Asia when it tries to talk about how it's going to interact with countries dealing with China. Same that it faces in Latin America, same that it faces in Africa. Europe is not different in kind. It's just different to a degree. The first is OBOR, One Belt, One Road, which was always designed to reach all the way over to the Atlantic, Western Europe, and actually beyond that. But in the broadest conceptualization, which I actually don't think China's going to get to, but in the broadest conceptualization, was to create an integrated trade bloc that was linked by infrastructure development, by aid development, by trade agreements and the like, that would recreate, it originally was called the New Silk Road, remember? That's probably a better way to think about it than the One Belt Road. It's the New Silk Road that reaches all the way to the UK, and China has actually been sending regularly trains from China to the UK, not because it's economically efficient, it's not. It's a terrible waste of money in terms of shipping goods, but because it's very symbolic about the reach and the connections that it's trying to make. Secondly, inside Europe, thinking about the China challenge, and something we have mentioned here, but I just want to stress it again, is security. It's the security angle. Peter talked a little bit about the bases. If I had a map, and I don't have a map, I'm sorry, but if I had a map, you could see that China is getting access to strategic bases all throughout the Eurasian landmass, but also Europe, throughout the Mediterranean. Peter mentioned the Piraeus in Greece. Italy has just signed up. It reaches up to Rotterdam. It reaches to Israel, and of course it reaches into the northern African littoral as well, and all through Africa. If you look where China is building bases or giving aid for naval ports, I mean, when I say bases, I'm talking about ports that can be conceived of as bases, to operate those bases or those ports or develop those ports, but certainly to have access. So the security angle is one in which China is gaining the foothold to have a permanent presence in a way that we don't fully understand how that will change security in Europe, but it would be foolhardy to assume that it won't in some way. 5G has been talked about a lot. We're focusing on it a lot. I would just say, take a look at the promises China, Huawei. What's the difference? Don't put that on tape. But the promises that Huawei has made to the British government to fill in security gaps, to make the system trustworthy. And the billions of dollars that it has pledged, and every British study that has come out, most recently just a month ago, says that it has not fulfilled those promises. So part of the question we can come to it from saying, is there a threat? Well, is Huawei controlled by the Chinese government? We don't, you can assume, but we don't know for sure. What we can look at is Huawei's actions in light of the concerns that have been raised, which have done nothing to mitigate the very real concerns and the studies that have shown the ways in which that network can be tapped into at different stages and what that would mean for security. And that leads into that broader question of the whole splinter net, another block that China might be trying to create. The human rights question, what we've seen with Greece and Hungary, other nations, is that as they have accepted aid from China, they have tempered their criticisms of China's human rights records and important issues in international fora, in essence, buying support. The more that China gets into Europe, the more that that's going to happen. And I guess it's connected with the 5G, but it was mentioned domestic surveillance and the export of the high-tech surveillance state. Inside China, a high-tech totalitarian state. So there are real threats that we face, potential threats that we face with China in Europe. And again, these are replicated around the world. Let me just then finish up by talking about, we talk a lot, mostly today, about inside Europe. What about inside Asia? And that's where I'm actually, in some ways, most interested in what this organization and other transatlantic organizations can do. I started off my comments by mentioning we've always gone it alone in Asia. It made sense. We didn't think we needed partners. We've recognized we need partners now. There is an enormous amount that Europe can do in Asia. Are they going to be putting in aircraft carriers, permanent base, the way that we do? No. Are they going to be having tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands, of forward deployed troops in the Indo-Pacific theater? No. But that doesn't mean that they cannot help on security issues, on human rights issues, on democratic governance issues. We have agreements right now of partnerships with the Royal Navy and the Japanese Navy to work with the US Navy on maritime security. Europe can do an enormous amount in helping Asian nations develop their maritime security capabilities. Surveillance techniques for understanding the environment in which you're in, intelligence and the like. Europe can help enormously with that, building off of our Five Eyes relationships. Democracy promotion. Europe can play a huge role in trying to counter and roll back what my Hoover colleague Larry Diamond calls the democratic deficit that is washing across the world, but washing across parts of Asia as well. And so we need to think not that we're going to be there with a French and a British and whoever else's aircraft carriers and F-35s, that may or may not happen. But we can be in Asia trying to maintain the gains of democratic liberalization that have happened over the past 30 years and encouraging those who want to go down that path further with our European allies. In some ways it makes it easier because it's not always then a US-China binary choice that those nations have to make. When the European nations get involved, it makes it easier for Asian nations to understand the benefits of being part of a liberal democratic community and the benefits at home of having liberal democratic systems. A new era, if we're in it, requires a new approach. And as much as we should be thinking about how to work with our European partners to counter a threat from China on the European continent, we should also be thinking about how to bring our European friends into the Indo-Pacific region to work with us on trying to ensure that the half of humanity that lives in the Indo-Pacific has a choice other than following the Chinese path.
So thank you for that. And in those comments, I really like how you linked China and Europe to the security conversation. So often I've had the experience where talking about NATO and military and security issues, you talk to the Russian people. There's an entirely separate conversation you have about China and economics. And those two stovepipes so rarely meet. So thank you for putting those together. I'm going to ask a few quick questions. and then I'm going to turn to the audience. So everyone, please be thinking about your questions. I want to fit in one round of audience Q&A. Dr. Navarro, let me start with you. I have a lot of conversations with friends in Europe about economics and trade, and a lot of times they're a little bit contentious. And I was listening to Chancellor Merkel's commencement speech at Harvard a few weeks ago, and I heard her say as part of that speech, trade conflicts threaten the foundation of our prosperity. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the rhetoric. I'd like to get your take on this. Was her statement about trade conflicts and trade wars, is that the whole story? Is trade conflicts oftentimes, seems to me, a reflection and expression of deeper problems, of countries not playing by the rules. But somehow that conversation is very hard to have with our European friends. Do you have a reaction, or why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's beyond irony that Chancellor Merkel would make that statement, given that within the European alliance, Germany is generally regarded as mercantilist. They have fiscal policies and wage policies which have effectively led to the undervaluation of what's called the real effective exchange rate to the detriment of Greece, Italy, Spain, France, virtually every other country in the EU. They don't, from a fiscal policy point of view, they don't carry their weight in terms of appropriate stimulus to the continent. And they run the largest, this is mind-boggling. Think about this. Germany runs the largest trade surplus in the world, not just in absolute terms, but as a percentage of their GDP. That is beggar thy neighbor. So for Chancellor Merkel to talk about trade conflicts, and Germany has been criticized by many in Europe for their own trade practices, I find, as I said, beyond irony. I think that for this alliance to work between the U.S. and Europe, and I love what Michael Auslin said about the Indo-Pacific being one big alliance, democratic and free, we're going to have countries step up and do their part. There's a reason why Hungary and Bosnia and other countries in Europe go to China for money, because they can't get it inside the zone. So there has to be, the EU has to be the EU, right? So, I admire it.
Thank you for that. Dr. Auslin, in our two keynote speeches, Mr. Mulvaney and Congressman Boyle, we heard two competing narratives, I might say. On one hand, from the congressman, is the alliance under threat, perhaps the most of his lifetime. Mr. Mulvaney, that America first isn't America alone. If I could put you, as a policy person in Beijing right now, how is this competing? How do these two competing narratives look to Beijing, look to the Chinese Communist Party? When they look to Europe, when they look to the U.S., and they see us having this conversation, do they see opportunity, or how are they seeing us right now?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that in terms of the domestic, here and in Europe, and then how China takes it, and the strains on the alliance. Look, China's approach to Europe has been very strong. This hasn't happened in the last 2 years or 5 years. It's been a very slow and steady outreach, engagement, penetration, whatever you want to call it. of Europe. And so I think that all along, first of all, China wanted access to the common market, right, as the world's largest unified trading bloc. And Peter mentioned the 16+1, which is, you know, a new twist on trying to get access into that and create relationships that if they're not exclusive, they have the potential for wrapping countries into China more than you would think normally in terms of just a regular type of trading relationship. So I don't think that they said, oh, January 20th, 2017, holy cow, you know, this is what we've been waiting for. I think it's been a much longer approach that China's had to trying to see where it can have access into Europe. It has sent students over there the way it sent students here for a very long time. There's been some good reports, if you want to look. In fact, there was two German think tanks that, I think it was called the Cater Institute in Germany, if I've got it right. They did a joint report at looking at China's influence operations in Europe, and you compare that with other reports, including one that the Hoover Institution just did on China's influence operations in the United States, and then also touched on other parts of the world. So they always think that this is, you know, I don't want to go back to the old days of, you know, Marxism, Leninism, and dialectical struggle and superstructure and the like, but they understand that this has always been a long-term policy for them, and therefore, if there are fluctuation points, whether we're at one or not today, they're very sensitive to it, and they want to try to take advantage of it. But I wouldn't say that it is necessarily different in kind from saying that China is always going to be trying to penetrate as much as it can into Europe for those markets and that strategic access.
Thank you, and I love both your answers, and this one is wonderful because you hit on a really key point that it's not just about 2016 or 2017, it's not about any particular administration or leaders. This is a long-term plan, and China will be trying to do this regardless of the personalities or who's in office, and it's absolutely key to understand. You mentioned a few times about Chinese investment, and Chinese influence, and maybe, and I could ask you, SITE has been a real leader in doing research and writing about the phenomenon of corrosive capital. And we talked about 16+1, we talked about Belt and Road, Orbor. Maybe you can give us a little bit of detail about how, in SITE's research, how has corrosive capital been having an effect in Europe? And does it affect all of Europe the same way? Does it have different manifestations or different effects in different parts of the continent?
So since we are mentioning reports, I would be remiss not to put a plug for a report that my organization SITE published last year precisely on that topic. So looking at the tide of, again, what we call corrosive capital, defined as capital coming from authoritarian countries like China, like Russia, also others, that often is politically motivated, or even if it has an economic calculus, that calculus may be subject to other longer-term geostrategic considerations. Now, that capital, whether be it in the form of aid or investment, which again, in the case of China, are blended together, it's not easy to sort of draw the line. Even private investment, or where the line between private and public money is very hard to draw. So the question we posed was, how does that easy money, as Dr. Navarro rightfully called it, impact recipient countries where their own institutions of democratic oversight, of transparency, of independent journalism may not quite be up to par. And again, the overwhelming evidence is that in such cases, influx of that non-transparent capital exacerbates existing governance gaps. We weren't looking just at Europe specifically. In the case of Europe, we were particularly looking at Western Balkans, places like Serbia or Montenegro, where actually Russia is a predominant player, and in some ways the picture is clearer, the narrative is easier because there is very clear political motivation. Russian investments are very targeted into strategic sectors such as energy or media, often. So economic investment is accompanied by other softer ways of influence. In Serbia, for instance, Russian investment directly or directly accounts for something like 13% of GDP, and investment in certain energy companies also accompanied by Serbian-speaking outlets of Russian television. So you have this mix of soft or maybe sharp power, that's another term for it, and hard physical investment money. China, yes, her presence is felt in Europe as well, although in terms of her investment, we were looking primarily at other countries, again, also of strategic importance, and also places where you wouldn't necessarily think China may be interested in, that illustrate how sort of a global scheme the Belt and Road Initiative is. I'm thinking of Argentina, for instance, which is not by any stretch in the Asia-Pacific zone or Chinese neighborhood, but it is in the category of a country such as Greece at one point where other sources of lending dry up, and China offers this easy alternative. Now, the misconception is that this is no strings attached funds, unlike, say, World Bank funding or EBRD or any other European American lender, and that is not exactly true, as we have seen in Greece, as we have seen in Sri Lanka, for instance, where also Chinese investment in a port later led to takeover, essentially, of that asset by China. So there are dangers just from the very economic perspective. Is this really a good deal for countries that accept the money? But beyond sort of the economic calculus, other strings attached often have to do with Chinese labor being imported as part of those projects, with those projects being sole sourced to Chinese state-owned companies, meaning local private sector, local businesses. Citizens do not quite get to participate in whatever economic benefits those projects generate. Usually, we've seen cases of domestic laws that have to do with things like environmental impact assessments not being complied with, and sort of general lack of transparency. In the case of Argentina, I mentioned there were large infrastructure loans involved that were not really publicly discussed. The terms were not made public, and also those numbers didn't make it to the national budget. So the debt trap is a real threat for countries, as are broader governance impacts of that funding. So sort of one key response, both in Europe and anywhere else in any country that either receives or contemplates taking in that type of funding, is awareness. So you have to go into it with eyes wide open, understand the risks, and helping strengthen domestic institutions. Again, we're talking about domestic democratic institutions, independent journalism, parliamentary oversight, so that we can increase the transparency and accountability of those financial flows.
Thank you. It's a very good morning on that front. We have less than 10 minutes left. I'd like to fit in a comment or two from the audience. But I see here we have in the first row our Mr. Lambrinidis, who is the newly arrived ambassador from the EU to Washington. Thank you for being with us, sir, and I understand you're off to a fantastic start. Thank you, exactly. And we didn't talk about this, but maybe I can put you on the spot and invite you up to the podium and try to deliver your comment from there.
Thank you very much, Scott, Richard, Reuf, for this remarkable initiative. Congratulations. I focus on the bipartisan nature. I think that's a huge thing, especially for us in Europe. We have been fundamentally based and effective on bipartisanship, in fact on multi-partnership. We just had the European elections, and first message was that those parties in Europe that advocate fanatically for the breakup of the EU actually remained extremely contained. The vast majority of parties elected very much for the EU. Second message is that the European Parliament, as always, will not have a majority. And yet, so not a single party, even the biggest one in Europe is a majority. And yet, if you look at the last 5 years, our borders have been much more secure with the European Coast Guard. We have trade agreements with 71 countries all over the world opening up our borders. We have spent more than 100 billion additional on defense and NATO, and now coordinating more together with European countries. Our climate change commitments are going fantastically well. We're looking at privacy values. I'm mentioning this to indicate that Europe is extremely strong and extremely united, even in difficult times. And I would hope that this is also a message of US-Europe alliance. In other words, yes, there are differences, but we're not split. In the same way that you in this country have big differences, big debates, but we never see you as a split country. We see you as our biggest ally, our biggest friend. We build together this international order, we can continue doing so. Very quickly to wrap up. I mentioned values, they are important. If you look at the issue of the relation with China, the Belt and Road Initiative does not simply export perhaps unsustainable investments and debt traps. It also tries to export cheap values, government values, human rights values. We are on the same side and started this, but we got to do it together. Europe is the biggest development aid donor in the world, by far. 57% of all development aid comes from Europe. That is not money with strings attached. That is money that is given to governments and to companies to be able to invest and build roads, schools, bridges, all these things. So, query, isn't it not reasonable for the US and the EU to sit together and think together strategically what kinds of investments is it that we do not absolutely want to fall into the hands of other countries? And then make sure that we finance them together in an intelligent way, in a way that doesn't take 1,000 years, in order to be able to counter the cheap money that comes from other countries. That's the kind of discussion we don't have enough, in my view at least, because we do, unfortunately, end up spatting over small and quite honestly not true important big issues. We have issues on trade, industrial goods. The European Union is ready to reduce tariffs on industrial goods to almost zero. Is the US? Tomorrow. It is not the issue of unfairness that creates a problem in our relations. It is perhaps our inability to understand together that this is a different world, indeed with threats that you have described, that do not allow us the luxury to be any more spatting over stuff that is of minimal importance in this difficult world. So I look forward here in this country to be able to promote that kind of vision. I think that your organization brilliantly put it in the middle of our discussions, what it is that we have to achieve. I believe in bipartnership. I believe in the challenges of the 21st century being attacked together. Closing, the biggest example, artificial intelligence. In our democracies, in our values, as Peter Navarro so correctly put it, in the world that we built together, it is the citizens that are supposed to be observing and judging the actions and the thoughts of the governments every day. Not the governments that are supposed to be observing and judging the actions and the thoughts of their citizens. If you go to that second thing, you don't have democracy anymore. You have entirely different. And yet, this is what is happening with the Ubers as we speak. Because artificial intelligence is used and standards are being set to allow for that to happen. But we're just building this now. It's not done. And if the European Union and the United States sit together and decide to set those standards ourselves, we will save the world. That is how important this relationship is. And that is why I hope that we'll work together with you to make it happen even more effectively than today. Thank you. Thank you very much.
very much.
By the way, this will obviously challenge the United States on the going to zero tariffs. It's not a really legitimate challenge because the real problem in Europe, besides the big tariffs, are the non-tariff barriers, harmonized standards. Very difficult to sell in new markets. So what we'd love to see is have you reduce your beef tariffs from 67% down to what ours are. Is there any reason, would anybody in this room think why the European Union should charge this country 10% tariffs on automobiles, which is the heart of the European economy, when you charge them 2.5%? So when you make those challenges, you need to put this in the broader context of a huge trade deficit that we run with Europe, that's driven not just by the unfair tariffs, but by this vast web of non-tariff barriers that not only affect the U.S., but between countries, you guys still have problems. So we need to have a good trade deal. It would be a great trade deal if Donald Trump negotiates it. But this whole idea of zero tariffs is going to solve things. That's a red herring with a little sugar.
Well, thank you. We're unfortunately out of time. I'm going to thank everyone. I promise if you got to here by 10:30, and you will. But I will say, thank you all for coming. And even this little exchange here, I think, is informative. We see, even though we have disagreements and things we want to talk about, we have shared interests, and I think there are people of very goodwill on both sides. And I think with that, we can continue to live in a prosperous and safe world. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the launch event of the U.S. Europe Alliance. Thank you to our panelists. We look forward to staying in touch with many of you in this room and letting you know what happens, our programming develops over the next 20 months. Thank you, everyone, and please join me in